Okay, so let's continue. Okay, so in the first half, towards the end, we said there are three different critiques regarding to the effectiveness of government fiscal policy, particularly expansionary fiscal policy. Now let's just look at them one by one. Claim number one: government spending always crowd out private spending. Right? So how we understand that? So just think about in this background picture, right? So in this jacuzzi or this hot tub. So if the hot tub is already full, and then so if we have someone else jumps in, so it is going to squeeze everybody else, right? But however, if when you jump in this hot tub, so the hot tub is pretty empty, will that squeeze somebody else? No, right? So in that sense, the claim number one, whether it is true or not, depending on the state of the economy. If the economy is pretty weak or the aggregate demand is very low, okay? And then the government spending won't crowd out private spending, all right? Or in other words, if the economy is not fully operating, and then so the government spending actually can help the economy, right? By enlarge the size of the economy, right? So this is kind of number one. And what is wrong with number one? Okay. Now, the second claim or critiques: government borrowing always crowd out private investment spending, right? So this is only partly true, but it depends upon whether the economy is depressed or not, right? So actually, if the economy is very depressed, meaning so we are in a deep recession, and then the government borrowing will lead to higher income, okay? Meaning so we are going to make our economic pie larger, and then so that's going to lead to increase the saving, and there are more money available for private sector to invest, and also include the public private sector invest, right? Now the third claim says government budget deficit reduce private saving. So this is known, or this is famous known as Ricardian equivalence. So this Ricardian or Ricardo, this is named after David Ricardo. So this is the same David Ricardo. We study the comparative advantage at the beginning of this semester. Okay? David Ricardo, so he discovered this Ricardian equivalence. What is the story? The story goes as follows. So today, the government increase deficit, okay? And why they need to increase deficit is because they borrow more. And why they want to borrow more is because they may want to borrow more to pay government spending or to pay for government transfer, like the current government is doing, right? Okay, and then to seeing the higher debt today, the households realize so eventually the government must do something to pay off the debt. Like right now, the U.S. government, the Biden administration is discussing raising the tax, right? Okay, and why they need to raise the tax is because they have to generate extra tax revenue to pay off the debt. But where does the debt coming from, or the extra debt coming from? So they have initiated massive stimulus plan. Right? And why they want to have this stimulus plan is because they're trying to rescue the economy. So this is the logic. Now this critique says, or the Ricardian equivalent says, so you, as the government, you borrow and then you use your borrowed money to give the households to rescue the economy will have no real effect. Why is that? It's because so you give households, you give the private sector money, but this private sector or the households, they understand. So in the future, you have to raise tax to pay off your extra debt. And to the household, it just is kind of swap my hand, right? So you are going to give me some money from to my left hand, but then so you are going to extract some money from my right hand side, right side hand. So here, so I use my left hand side to represent today, and my right hand side to represent my future. Okay, and then from the household point of view, so it just doesn't make any change. Hence, so you give me money today won't affect my spending behavior today at all. Okay? But so this argument has its limitation. Okay, so there are two limitations at least. Number one, so yes, the government will increase tax, but this tax, the tax burden will not fall on the shoulder of the population equally, right? So like, say for example, the current Biden administration, so their proposed tax increase, most of the burden will fall on the corporate or falls on richer households, right? So why that matters is because the spending they proposed will go to lower income, all right, or like a median income. Meaning, so for them, so they are going to see an increase in income or disposable income, but relatively lower or smaller increase in their tax. Hence, that's going to have real impact on their current spending. This is number one. And then number two, just imagine if the government borrow in a very, very long term. So for example, 100 years, this actually, it is happening now. And the meaning, so the spending increase and the transfer they provide today, okay, and will have no, so eventually they have to pay, but when they have to pay them, so this is going to have no real impact on the person or on the households. So they are going to provide extra spending, extra transfer today, right? Because those households already gone. They're not in the economy anymore. So they will not share the burden of the tax when the government decide to pay off their debt, right? So these are two answers to this critique, to say the government budget deficit may not necessarily reduce private spending, or in other words, Ricardian equivalence may not always hold true. Okay, so these are three critiques. Okay. Now, we have seen the fiscal policy can help the economy, right? And we also discuss some potential critiques and some answers to those critiques, right? But overall, it just says, so when the economy is in a recession, it makes sense for the government to respond in a proactive way, and usually to carry out some expansionary fiscal policy. Yeah. But however, in reality, so there's a caution, right? Or there's something we need to pay attention. So when we use fiscal policy, so usually there are significant lags in its use. Okay? And why there's lags, there are following reasons. Okay? Because in reality, it's going to take time to do the following three things before the fiscal policy the government decide to carry on has real impact on the economy. Okay? Number one, it will take time for us to realize we are in a recessionary or inflationary gap. This is because we must collect data and analyze data, right? So it's going to take a while. Okay, usually take a couple of months. And then number two, it's going to take time to develop a plan. So that just says, okay, so if we knew we are in a recession, and then so the economists work for the Congress or work for the president or work for the government, basically. So they must develop a plan to how to fight the recession. It usually takes time, right? Not months, maybe like weeks or at least days. Right? And finally, if they have a plan, and then it's going to take time to implement the plan, right? So including, so first, so they need to get approval from the Congress. And once they get approval from the Congress, they need to allocate the resource to different sectors or different parties or different individuals. Okay? And so even though everybody receives the money, but still take time for them, I mean, in terms of private sector, to take appropriate response. Right? So to summarize, it's going to take time. But certainly, our economy is advancing every day, every year. Okay, so this time lag becomes shorter and shorter, right? Let's go one by one. Number one, so because we have more powerful tools like computer to collect data, okay, and this day we have like high frequency data, meaning the economists they can collect data on a daily basis to understand so where we are in terms of business cycle. So this time lag is going to be very short. Number two, develop plan. So now we have so many economists work on understanding our economy. So usually, so this is going to take shorter time. And so when we in a recession, sometimes the politician becomes more resolute than before. So it's going to take shorter time. Number three, so this implementation. So again, thanks for the new technology. Right? So like the check from the government usually take like hours, right? So they can electronically send households the money instead of send you by mail, right? Okay. Now let's look at this practice question. Okay. Contractionary fiscal policy. A is most helpful for restoring the economy to potential output when there's a recessionary gap. This is not correct. So contractionary fiscal policy usually will reduce aggregate demand. Right? So if we are in a recessionary gap, so this contractionary fiscal policy is going to make things worse. B, shift aggregate demand to the right, restore the equilibrium. That's not correct, right? So the contractionary fiscal policy will reduce aggregate demand, shift the aggregate demand to the left. C, often cause inflation. No, that's not true, right? So reduce aggregate demand, so that's going to reduce or dampen the price level. D, if effective, shift aggregate demand to the right, resulting in a reduction in aggregate output and the aggregate price. That's correct. Right? So this is how contractionary fiscal policy can work. Okay. Okay. So the answer is D. Right. Let's look at another practice question. Okay. Which of the following statement is true, holding everything else constant? A, an economy can eliminate an inflationary gap by increasing government spending. So that's not true, right? If we are in an inflationary gap, okay, and then now if you increase government spending, so you're going to lift off aggregate demand. The aggregate demand shift to the right. So actually, so that's going to increase the price level or make the inflationary gap even larger. Okay. B, expansionary fiscal policy refers to an increase in tax. No. So expansionary fiscal policy is a policy that helps to increase aggregate demand. Okay? But if there's an increase in tax, that's going to reduce aggregate demand by indirectly affect consumption and investment. C, when potential output is greater than actual output, the economy is facing a recession gap. That's correct, right? So if your potential is greater than actual, meaning you produce less than you potentially can produce, we are in a recession. D, when short-run aggregate supply intersect with aggregate demand to the right of long-run aggregate supply, the economy faces a recessionary gap. No, actually, so short-run aggregate supply intersect with aggregate demand. That gives our realized GDP. So this realized GDP is to the right of long-run aggregate supply, meaning so we produce more than we can potentially produce. Okay, and then that means we are in the expansionary or inflationary gap. Okay, so the answer is C. All right, so we can look at some real-life examples. How the government respond to recession. Okay, in 2009, so the American government implement the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So this is as a response to the Great Recession in 2008. Okay, it's caused by the financial crisis. Right, and back then, so the government spent around 800 billion. So that's just total things. Okay, the way they spend so includes tax cut and include transfer to state and local government, and include transfer payment to households like unemployment. Remember earlier I showed you a video called 99 years, right? So the government extend the unemployment insurance benefit, okay? And those money was covered by these acts, right? And finally, so we have infrastructure and other spending. So this is through the hand of government, increase consumption and investment. Now the other example, so this is last year's CARES Act, right? So this CARES Act was initiated or as a response to the COVID-19, right? So the total cost of this CARES Act was 2.3 trillion. Okay, so this under President Trump. Actually, President Biden, so he has another act. Okay, so it's called Bring Back Better, right? Okay, so this 2.3 trillion was used for different things, right? So this includes direct payment like households, unemployment, and tax break, loans to support business, and grant also support business and other spending. So largely goes to healthcare provider and emergency responders. Right. Okay. Now we are going to look at another topic, which is multiplier. Right. So what is multiplier? So multiplier, the original idea says, so if I spend $1, okay, and then so my $1 spending becomes somebody else's income, and then so whoever receive this $1 as income, and he or she is going to spend, right? And then so if he or she receive $1 and is going to spend some, and then so he or she, his or her spending based on the $1 received from me will becomes a third person's income. Now the third person in this discussion or in this economy will also do a similar spending. Now the third person's spending will become the fourth person's income. So you can see it's so on and so forth. So we're going to have a multiplier. Now we're going to have a multiplier for government expansionary fiscal policy. Right? Now let's see how that happen. Okay. Okay. So the multiplier basically magnifies new spending into greater level of income and output because each round of spending becomes income for somebody else. Right? So that's just what I just explained to you. Okay. And here, so just remind you, so we have calculated the multiplier, right? So 1 over 1 minus MPC, right? And so this MPC is the marginal propensity to consume. For example, so if we have a marginal propensity to consume of 0.5, meaning so if I have $1 additional income, I'm going to spend 50 cents. And then the multiplier is going to become 1 over 1 minus 0.5 equals 2. So that just means if the government initiate 50 billions of new spending, so that's going to create 100 billions increase in real GDP. Okay, so this is a multiplier. But the reality, so the multiplier usually is smaller than this number, this hypothetical 2, for a couple of reasons. Right? So for example, so when the government spend 50 billion, right? So this 50 billions becomes somebody else's income. That's fine. But now, so someone or whoever received this 50 billion, so they must pay tax, right? And so out of this tax, they can spend. So meaning, so the amount they're going to spend is going to less than 50 times MPC. So this is most times the tax they paid, right? So let me explain to you. This 50, so this whoever receive or whoever provide goods and service to the government. So this is their pre-tax income. Now we must multiply the 1 minus tau. Tau is the tax rate, right? So and then so multiply 1 minus tau. So this is the households or whoever provide goods and service to the governments. This is their net tax income. And then so they can use this net tax income, or we call disposable income, to do next round of spending multiplied by MPC. Right? So now the existence of this tax is going to reduce this multiplier. Okay. So now we also want to look at other aspect of multiplier. Okay, which is so the multiplier effect will change or will depend on whether it's a transfer or is a reduction in tax. Right? And to understand this idea, let's just look at an example. Okay. So just imagine the government decide to initiate 50 billions of stimulus. But this 50 billions has two ways to implement. Either it's a tax cut or transfer. Or so it's a 50 billion increase in government purchase. How you understand that? So there are two scenarios. Scenario number 1, the government give us 50 billion and let us to spend. Scenario number 2, the government is going to initiate this progress itself. So the government decides to spend 50 billion immediately. Okay? Either this 50 billion goes to purchasing vaccine, or this 50 billion goes to renovate the highway system or the healthcare system. Okay, but nevertheless, the government initiate the spending immediately. Okay, now the question is, how would these two different policy affect our economy? Will be the same or different? So that's what we need to understand, right? So now let's see how they're different. Okay, so in this table, so we have two scenarios. Here, in this scenario, the government initiate the program itself, or the government start with purchase of goods and service. Okay. But now here, instead of increase government purchase, the government hands the households 50 billions of check. Okay. Now let's see, so what will be their net impact on our economy? Start with the right hand side one. Okay, so if the government give us some check, let us to decide. Okay, so now we collectively receive 50 billion from the government. Okay, and given, let's just say we have a marginal propensity to consume of 0.5, right? Because here is MPS equal to 0.5, means MPC equal to 1 minus 0.5 equal to 0.5. Okay, so now we receive 50 billions from the government. Now we're going to spend half, so that's give you 25. Okay, and then so whatever we spend, it becomes to somebody else's income. And somebody else in the economy receive 25 billions of income, so they're going to spend. How much they're going to spend? 50%. So that's they are going to spend. Now, whoever received this 12.5 billion, so they are going to spend as well, right? Because they have additional income. And then, so how much they're going to spend? They're going to spend another half. So on and so forth. So we end up with the total impact on the economy is 50 billion because we just add them together. Right? Now, let's erase everything and go to the left-hand side. So instead of hand households some free checks, the government decide they are going to spend the money themselves. Okay? The civic example, the government spent 50 billion to buy vaccines. Or the government decide to spend this 50 billion to build up a new hospital. Right? Now what happened next? So immediately see the aggregate demand will increase by 50 billion because G increased by 50 billion. Now you can see the difference in the first step. Right? In the first round, the government spent 50 because the government decides to spend all the money. Now, in this case, the government gives us 50 billion, and then we decide to spend half. Right? So that's different. Now look at the second round. So the government spent 50, and this 50 billion becomes our income. And we are going to spend a fraction, which goes to 25. Right? So in some sense, this 25 corresponds to this 25. Right? And then, so on and so forth, this 12.5 corresponds to this 12.5 until toward the end of the process. Now, the difference between a rise in government purchase of goods and service compared with a rise in government transfer, the main difference is, so here we have this initial round, but not in this case, right? And then toward the end, you can see, so the eventual effect of rise in government purchase of goods and service will be larger, 100 billion versus 50 billion. Okay, so this is the multiplier effect, And this multiplier effect will depending on how the government use the money. Okay? Whether it is a directly increase government spending or it is indirectly increase the government transfer. So the net impact will be very different. Okay? Make sure we understand the difference between increase in government purchase of the goods and service versus a increase in government transfer. Right? And make sure you understand so why we end up with this 100 versus 50 billion. Right? And other things I want to emphasize is here, so when we do the analysis, we leave aside the tax issue. So what is the tax issue we leave aside? Let's just go to the, right here, right? So we ignore these things, right? So we just look at this hypothetical multiplier, right? Okay, so even with this hypothetical or this perfect measure of multiplier, and we find out from this discussion, so depending on how the government spend the money, so the net impact is going to be different, right? So usually, government direct spending will be more powerful compared with households, compared with providing transfer and let the households to decide. But certainly there's some caveat, or we need to take this conclusion very cautiously. In the sense, so the government spending in the first round could potentially be wasteful. But here we just assume so the government is a good government and is an effective government. They know how to spend the money wisely, right? Okay, so for today we will stop here, and the next class we will pick up from this slide, and then so we will finish this chapter, right? Thank you so much for your attention.